Dr. Lopez. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity to be here. I'm so excited to have the chance to talk to you about some of our work at the Pew Research Center. A lot of our work focuses on many of the, let's see, I'm sorry, I'm getting a notice here. So a lot of the work that we do is focused on how U.S. Latinos see their identity. So I want to share with you some of the findings that we've had over the years about the ways in which the many different terms people use are used by the population, who uses it, and what are some of the patterns that we've noticed in terms of use. And I look forward to our conversation overall as we discuss some of these different ways that people identify. But before I do that, yes?
Sorry to interrupt you. We're seeing like the notes from the PowerPoint. If you want to go to display settings and just switch them.
Let's see. How about that? Is that better?
No, no. Now we're looking at the whole presentation.
Okay, let me see. I'm sorry about that. Let me try one more time here. That getting it there or still no?
No, if you go to display setting on top,
it's
going to give you an option to just switch it.
Yeah, I couldn't quite get all of that to show. Let me see. My apologies, folks. There's so much to talk about. And all right, so I'm gonna. How about now? Is that better?
There you go. Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. And my apologies, everybody, for the delay there. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about who the Pew Research Center is, to give you a sense of the work that we do and what this and the ways in which to think about the work that the center does. We're based in Washington, D.C. We're a nonprofit, what we call fact tank. And our mission is to provide information to the public and to policymakers and to generally to anybody who's interested in understanding some of the important trends shaping the nation's Latino community and Latino population, but also some of the trends shaping the nation and the world. The team that I lead, the Global Migration and Demography Research Team, is a team that actually has been in place for a few years now, but comes out of the work that we've been doing for over a decade on U.S. Hispanics. I used to be the director, for example, of the Pew Hispanic Center and the Pew Hispanic Trends Project, both of which predate the Global Migration and Demography team. But it's important to note that we're nonpartisan, we're non-advocacy, and we take no positions on policy. So I might get some questions today from some of you about things that one might do. I can't make any recommendations, but I'll try to point you to some of our research that might be informative and helpful in answering the question that you might have. So let me get started by first pointing out how big is the population of people who, and it's important to note, self-identify as part of the nation's Latino or Hispanic population. That number is about 61 million people, and that's as of 2019. You can see that the population has grown quite rapidly since the 1970s, and importantly, since 2000, the growth in the nation's Hispanic population has accounted for about half, if not more, of the United States overall population growth during the same period. So US Hispanic population growth is important for the nation's population growth overall. But whenever we talk about this population, I think it's important to keep in mind that the ways in which it sees itself oftentimes don't quite fit with the labels that you see we oftentimes use to summarize the population, particularly words like Hispanic or Latino. But instead, people oftentimes focus on their origin groups, where their families or ancestors are from. This is a list as of 2018 to show you the largest origin groups among that 60 million or so Latinos in the United States. And you can see Mexicans alone make up the single largest group, about 62% of the population, followed by Puerto Ricans, who are at about 10%. And then you can see the population numbers start to decline rather quickly. The numbers in the column after each one of the origin groups' names is in millions, the number of people in that group living in the 50 states plus the District of Columbia. So as you can see, Hondurans and up are all at least 1 million people, but Mexicans and Puerto Ricans together are the two largest groups, and I think it's important to keep that in mind. When we also look at these origins, though, while those may be the largest groups, one of the interesting stories is that since 2010, the fastest growing groups have actually been Venezuelans, Dominicans, and Guatemalans. And so the combinations and composition of the population is changing as new waves of migration enter the United States from Latin America. But while immigration is still an important source of growth for the population, I think it's also important to note that for this population overall, the share who are foreign-born or who are immigrants is on the decline. Today, only about 33% of the overall population of Latinos in the United States say that they were born in another country. And you can see that that is a decline that's happening across virtually every origin group, with Venezuelans and Spaniards being unique in this, and that they have actually seen an increase in the share who say that they are born in another country in recent years. For Venezuela, I don't think that's any surprise given some of the recent out-migration from Venezuela to various parts of the world, including the United States. I want to talk, though, about the terms and the ways in which Latinos identify themselves when it comes to how they describe their identity. And at the Pew Research Center, we've been doing public opinion surveys of the nation's Latino population for some time now. And this is a result that is pretty consistent across the last decade and a half of surveys. We ask people in this population, have they ever used any of these terms, their country of heritage term, Hispanic or Latino, or American to describe their identity, and which one do they use most often, if they use any of these at all, to describe themselves. And you can see that about half say their country of heritage term is a term that they use most often to describe themselves. That's particularly true among immigrant Hispanics. 56% of them in our most recent survey from 2019, December of last year actually, tell us that that's what they use most often to describe themselves. But you can see that the use of country of heritage as a term to describe identity declines across the generations. The second generation, or I should say the US-born children of immigrant parents, are less likely to use it than immigrants themselves. And those who are in the third or higher generation, that is US-born with US-born parents, are less likely than the second generation, for example, to use country of heritage to describe themselves. The second most common terms that are used are pan-ethnic terms like Hispanic or Latino, and the third most common is the term American. But as you can see, American rises in use as we go through the generations as well. You might be wondering why all these terms are being used and why people might use some of them more often than others. The context in which questions are asked about how somebody sees their identity or how they identify themselves will play a big role in determining what answer you might get from somebody. Particularly if, for example, it's a Latino to a Latino, you might find that people will self-report their country of heritage. If it's in the United States and it's a non-Latino to somebody who's Latino, you might find that they use a pan-ethnic term like Hispanic, Latino, or Latinx. And if it's somebody who's perhaps from another country, like say from Germany or from Japan, you might find that some people of Latino heritage in the United States who self-identify as Latino might actually tell that person that they are American. So the combination of terms in which people use most often does depend a lot on the context and who's asking. And the reason why I bring that up is because there are other ways in which this population identifies itself. For example, we've asked in surveys at the Pew Research Center, do you consider yourself Afro-Latino, Afro-Caribbean, or Afro, for example, Mexicano? Asking about identity in this way, being both very direct about it, are you Afro-Latino, for example, but also giving people a chance to identify with this one particular identity, you find that, for example, about a quarter of US adult Hispanics tell us that they're Afro-Latino. But if you were to ask in a race question, the way the Census Bureau does, are you white, Black or African American, Native or Native American, Asian, Asian American, Pacific Islander, or some other race, you'll find that a very small share, fewer than 5% of Latino adults will self-identify as Black. So asking about Afro-Latino directly does get us a different set of responses. And again, I think the context matters, how you ask the question, and who's asking the question can matter as well. And that's also important for whether or not people see themselves as mestizo or mestiza. And we at the Pew Research Center have asked this question in a survey back in 2014, where we asked Latinos whether or not they consider themselves to be belonging to more than one racial group, such as mestizo or mulatto. And you can see that about a third of the Hispanic population in the United States considers themselves to be mixed race or multiracial. And again, here too, this is a different set of responses, a much higher response rate than one gets if you ask the traditional Census Bureau's race question. Now, the terms that people use also vary a lot by where they live. So the places in different states across the country, for example, you'll find that in the very, very traditional question of Hispanic or Latino, which do you prefer, you'll find that in Texas, about half of people of this population in Texas prefer the term Hispanic, and relatively few prefer Latino, although almost equal share to the Hispanic share say they have no preference for the term. But everywhere else, we see that the no preference category for either Hispanic or Latino is actually the most common answer that we get when we ask the question about preferences for Hispanic or Latino. But Texas in this case stands out and only shows you how much it matters where you are in the country, the terms that people might use to describe themselves. More recently, a new term has emerged that people are using, and this is the term Latinx, which is a term that's meant to be a gender neutral term. It's meant to be an inclusive term, and it's one that's emerged in recent years in terms of its popular use. And by recent years, at least since 2015 or 2014, its use has started to increase. But we're also, this term has been around for a couple of decades now, and is an alternative to Latino and Latina. And but one of the things we wanted to do at Pew Research was ask whether or not the population of Hispanics has actually heard of the term. Have Latinos heard of the term Latinx? And we found that only 23% say that they've heard of Latinx, and just 3% overall of all Latino adults actually use the term to describe themselves. So relatively low awareness of the term and relatively low use of the term, at least among the nation's Hispanic population today. Now, I want to stress that this is not an evaluation of whether or not Latinx is a good term or a bad term to use, but it is an indication that the term is just not well known among the population. Now, I think this is also an interesting part of the story of how Latinos identify themselves, because new terms emerge all the time. And this is a new term that's emerged recently and is starting to gain usage among the population. It's very possible in 10 years, its popularity could be much greater than it is today, perhaps even eclipsing terms like Latino or Hispanic. We did ask in the same survey, though, today, which term does the population prefer to describe itself overall? And you can see that among adults, 61% say Hispanic is preferred, 29% say Latino is preferred, and just 4% say they prefer Latinx to describe the population in the United States overall. There is a little bit of variation across different different demographic groups and different segments of the population overall. But you can see that Hispanic is the preferred term over Latino and Latinx, generally speaking. We've also asked about identity in a couple of other ways. What are some of the key components of or essential parts of what it means to be Hispanic today, and how do people see some of these essential elements? And the single most essential part of being Hispanic today that people identify is speaking Spanish. 45% of all US Latinos say that that is an essential part of what being Hispanic means to them. It's particularly true among immigrants, though even among those in third and higher generation, 20% say that speaking Spanish is an essential part of what being Hispanic means to them. You can also see, though, that there are a number of other things we asked about, including having both parents of Hispanic heritage, socializing with other Hispanics, having a Spanish last name, participating in cultural celebrations, being Catholic, and even wearing or displaying attire that's associated with Hispanic heritage or origin. But speaking Spanish is the single one of these items that was identified most as being an essential part of what being Hispanic means today. Now, speaking of Spanish, you can see that when we ask about Spanish use, not everybody in this population speaks Spanish. Only about 30% of Hispanic adults are what we would call Spanish dominant, that is able to speak and understand spoken Spanish very well, or to be able to read written Spanish very well. 40% are bilingual and 30% are English dominant. And you can see that across the generations, the shares that are any one of these groups does change, with English dominant Hispanics making up the majority of those who are third and higher generation. We've also asked more directly whether or not you have to speak Spanish to be considered Hispanic. And interestingly, 71% say, no, you don't have to speak Spanish to be considered Hispanic in the United States today. You can see, though, that that does vary across generations, with the foreign-born perhaps most likely to say that, yeah, you need to speak Spanish to be considered Hispanic, but it does change across the generations. And what about having a Spanish surname? Here, too, it's not seen as something that's important to be considered Hispanic or Latino in the US today. Finally, I want to share with you something that's an important part of upcoming trends, things that I think are going to be impacting where the nation's Hispanic population's identity goes in the future. Did you know that about 1/4 of Latinos today who are newlyweds have married somebody who's not Latino? So the intermarriage rate of Hispanics is one of the highest among the large racial and ethnic groups in the country, and it's been consistently high for a number of decades. But with the slowdown in immigration from Latin America and the fact that Latinos, you have more young Latinos now being the children of a Hispanic parent and a non-Hispanic parent, what identity might be for this group into the future remains to be seen. It could change. Even the way in which we describe this population could be very different 20, 30, 40 years from now, as terms like Hispanic and Latino fade and new terms emerge, like Latinx is perhaps something that may become more used in the future. Of course, all that remains to be seen, and there's a lot of other trends that perhaps could impact this, and many different things that could overall shape identity into the future. But it's important to note that these are things that are changing. You can find all of our work at pewresearch.org, and you can also follow us on Twitter there or other social media outlets. And we'd love to hear from you if you have any questions, thoughts, or also just how you use our data. I'm going to stop sharing my screen there, but I want to say thank you for the opportunity to speak today, and I look forward to our questions. So thank you, and let me know if I haven't stopped sharing.
Yeah, I'm handing it over to Darius. We're going to do the question portion at the end, just so that everybody knows, but you can keep submitting your question because I've been keeping tabs on them.
Okay. Cindy, am I sharing my screen?
I saw it for a second, but then it disappeared. Let me try this again.
Okay, there you go. Okay, perfect. There we go. So thank you, Dr. Lopez, for your presentation and for all the wonderful resources that you provide for us. To tell you a little bit about myself, I'm a clinical psychologist, and I am in private practice, and I also work for the National Hispanic and Latino Mental Health TTC. I am the content and training specialist for the center, and previously I worked for the National Hispanic and Latino Addiction Technology Transfer Center as the trainer and content consultant. Okay. So let me go back. So the goal for my presentation today is to increase awareness among mental health providers about the complexities of identity development and its relation to mental health. So part of the work that we do, for those of you who are familiar with our work and who may have attended some of our trainings, this is one of the topics that really gets our audience to have a really rich conversation when we speak about Hispanic and Latino and which one is it and how people self-identify. So I think it's a really important topic to address. In terms of the objectives for today's presentation, we will describe basic concepts related to psychosocial identity development according to Erik Erikson, and really we'll just go through stage 5, identity versus role confusion. We'll define some concepts that are related to ethnicity and identity, elements that influence identity development specifically in Latinos. We'll see how identity can be a protective factor for mental health disorders in Latinos and implications for mental health services for Latinos. So as we recognize that our audience are mental health providers who serve Hispanic and Latino populations, we want to be able to provide you with some information regarding that. Okay. So I mentioned that part of the trainings that we do include conversations about identity and self-identity. So Dr. Lopez presented some information on demographics, and considering that there are 60.6 million Latinos in the US and that's about 18.5% of the population, really the numbers are a call for understanding Latino identities, also recognizing that sense of self is part of the ethnic culture, that identity is not only an individual concept, but also a collective concept, and how contexts like Dr. Lopez mentioned and group identification play a role in the way that we identify ourselves. So let's go to the other one. Cindy, I'm wondering if I can go back to here. Okay. So we recognize that social and cultural environment, institutions, sense of self, and that identity has elements that are cognitive, that are behavioral, and that are emotional. So that's some of the things that we'll be speaking about today. In terms of our Erikson's psychosocial development theory, I mentioned that we will be speaking about stage number 5. So according to Erikson, people progress through a series of stages in which they have to undergo a certain crisis, and once they go through that and they resolve that conflict, they continue to develop. So during the ages of 13 and 21, stage 5 usually takes place, which is identity versus role confusion. And it is during this time that individuals develop a personal identity, right? So the main question during this stage of development is, who am I? And not only who am I, but who am I and how I see myself and the world I live in. So the virtue that develops during this stage is fidelity, and what we will develop is a strong sense of self. Some of the events that are important during this stage include family relationships, and we know that that's a very important part of our development, and that our sense of self will develop according to interactions with family members, for example. But also during this stage, it is important to recognize that other groups may take an important role in the way that we see ourselves, and that includes friends, schoolmates, societal trends, and even pop culture. So you can imagine that for bicultural teens, this may be a really more complicated process to go through. So what is identity development? It is an internalized psychic system that integrates an individual's inner self, like we mentioned, with the outside world. And we create a congruent whole, right? So this is part of what Erikson established. But again, right, as we continue to develop in our field, some of the things that have come up is that it may no longer be an adequate model, since it doesn't recognize multiple identities. So what does that mean? That other identities are integrated into our sense of self, and that includes gender, that includes sorry, sexual orientation, and other identities that are part of who we are and how we identify. So we recognize now that identities based on demographic, that wasn't considered based on demographic characteristics, and there are unique traits, family dynamics, cultural and ethnic norms that do contribute to the way that we develop and our sense of self. We recognize that individuals are cultural beings that not only have a personal identity, but like Dr. Lopez mentioned, the context is really important as well. Okay. So we spoke about identity with development, and now we are recognizing other elements that come into play. So another concept that has been developed is social and group identity. And the definition is an integration of psychological and social theories that includes the way individuals identify with social groups. So we saw how, in the case of Latinos, we are categorized and we categorize ourselves in terms of social groups. So recognizing the collectivistic view that Latinos hold, the issue of social and group identity has an even bigger important role. So belonging to a group is also part of who we are, and a sense of belonging will contribute to the way that we see ourselves and the way that we see the world that we live in. So what happens when that group that we identify with is seen as negatively? What happens when we know that these groups that we identify with experience negative experiences? So that may also play a role in the way that we integrate some of the information that we are receiving while we develop a sense of self and an identity. So now we're going to go to ethnic identity. So we went from the individual and now to the collective. One of the groups that we belong to is an ethnic group. So this is why it, again, it's important to recognize all the elements of identity formation. So ethnic identity, broadly defined, is a dynamic and multidimensional construct that represents part of one's self-concept that is derived from a sense of belonging and a commitment to a particular ethnic group. So that means that it derives from sharing experiences with a particular group, identifying with a particular group, sharing values, beliefs, attitudes, culture, costumes, language, traditions, etc. So it includes not just self-identification, but also group affiliation. And yes, it's going to be influenced by acculturation and oppression. I wanted to mention in the case of Puerto Rico, similar to other colonized groups, we find that our identity can be influenced by some of the messages and some of the experiences that we have with the other group, meaning the US. So we'll find that some people will identify more with the country and some others will adhere to some of the values and beliefs of the country that colonized them in. So that's one thing that is going to be manifested in our therapeutic processes, and we want to be able to recognize it, and if the case calls for it, to address it. If that's an issue where the person is having some difficulty or conflict regarding their sense of self and their ethnic identity. So Latino identities. It is important to conceptualize. I just wanted to share this quote that I think really summarizes what it means. It is important to conceptualize Latino ethnic identities and its development as complex, dynamic, and involving many factors. Specifically, a variety of socioeconomic and political factors that may have an impact on the development of ethnic identity are often overlooked in the psychological literature. Also, within this socioeconomic and political context, there are inequities in education, employment, and health opportunities that play a significant role in the identity development of Latino youth. So why do we mention Latino youth? Going back to Erickson, it is during that period where identities are being formed. So I mentioned when I was speaking about some of the objectives of today's presentation, how we would go from the concepts of identity development, other elements that come, other concepts that have been developed, elements that come into play when we speak about ethnic identities and then mental health. I want to mention that we have many identities, and Dr. Lopez spoke about some of the categories that have been created, let's say, to group Latinos. However, when we have this conversation in trainings and other groups, one of the things that the takeaway is usually that individuals self-identified, and he mentioned it, right? So not everyone will go with the term Latino, not everyone will go with the term Hispanic. Most people from the numbers that he presented will go with their country of origin. But what we want to be able to do is have a conversation regarding identity, regarding self-identity, and the meanings that are attached to the identities that we decide for ourselves, right? From the experiences that we have, and we mentioned with family, with other groups, we will start to attach meanings to those experiences that tell us who we are and who we are in regards to this world that we're living in. So some of the things that are important to be considered in Latino identity development are acculturation, biculturalism, and generation. So let's start with acculturation. So for those of you who are familiar with the work of Barry, you know that Barry suggests that acculturation is a process in which you adopt and adhere to some of the values and practices and norms of the country where you migrate to, while maintaining some of the costume values and beliefs of your culture of origin, right? And this process is a bidirectional process. That means that not only immigrants will experience some changes in the behaviors, attitudes, and even internal thinking from being exposed to another culture, but the culture might be impacted as well. And I know you see it in the US. You see the increase in restaurants that serve food that is traditional from other cultures. You see it in the music, you see it in the news. So you see that there's an impact for both the individual and the host culture as well. So acculturation will affect not only behaviors and practices, but also self-identity. And the research has evidenced the intersection between acculturation processes and mental health in Latinos, right? And most studies have concentrated in acculturative stress, and we'll speak about that soon. Okay. So acculturation and mental health. So we mentioned that acculturation is a process in which we adopt certain behaviors, certain values, certain norms, and we also maintain some of the culture's values and norms from our country of origin, right? So what happens in Latino families sometimes is that young Latinos will acculturate at a faster rate than older Latinos. So that means, what that may mean, that within a family we'll find differences in acculturation rates, and that may result in distress, and that may result in conflicts within the family and among family members. So recognizing that, sorry. So recognizing that we understand that acculturation is an important element to explore with Latino families. And then acculturative stress has been studied for years, and acculturative stress is or may be the result from acculturation processes where this idea that you are trying to belong to any culture may result in anxiety symptoms. So it is the stress of trying to navigate a new culture where you may not know the language, the norms, the values, the beliefs, and the practices of the culture. right? Okay. Remember to include your questions in the chat box and we'll address them at the end of the presentation. So this study or other studies have included acculturation conflicts specifically. Cindy, I can hear you. So acculturation conflicts and the study of those means that within families, what has been studied is not only acculturation gaps, but conflicts that are specific to acculturation processes. That means within families, conflicts that have to do with practices that adolescents may be involved in, new ways of behaving, new ways of understanding the world, and that may result in conflicts that are specific to acculturation process. And what studies show is that that may result in greater depressive symptoms, lower self-esteem, more conduct problems, and even poor academic performance. So we know that Latino youth face some of the face universal problems, like differences with parent-adolescent conflicts, other issues that may be related to economic stressors and things like that that happen universally among families. But then it is important to also be able to address conflicts that are specific to the acculturation process. One of the things that may result from these conflicts is that in the adolescents may have another conflict with what is called ethnic positive regard. And as they're trying to integrate themselves in a new culture and they're finding it difficult to really fit in sometimes, and then they go home and their behaviors aren't accepted as well, and parents are trying to instill other values, then they may feel like I don't belong outside of my home and I don't belong inside of my home. And that really has an impact on identity because it may fracture the way that we developed identity. We were speaking about an integrated sense of self, and that may complicate that process. And then another element to take into consideration is discrimination. So as families experience more acculturation conflict, and if adolescents, like we were saying before, if adolescents are experiencing discrimination outside of the home, then again, the group that I identify with is not seen positively outside of my home, and then I'm not being seen positively inside of my home as well. So that will also have an impact on identity. However, for those individuals who are able to integrate both cultures, we know that biculturalism is one of the results of the acculturation process. And bicultural individuals exhibit particular characteristics that are even protective from mental health issues, right? So it means that you're able to integrate some of the values and norms from both cultures, right? So what studies say is that when you're able to do this, you're able to hold positive views on both cultures, and that has a positive impact, and that bicultural individuals have unique characteristics that include cognitive flexibility, the ability to adapt to different contexts, and those openness, acceptance, and that means that they will have and they report better mental health outcomes. In terms of generation, I just want to mention we spoke about how there may be acculturation gaps within families, and Dr. Lopez presented also differences in self-identification according to generation. So this is another element to really address if you're working with Latino families. So what we understand is that a consistent, congruent identity is associated with better mental health outcomes, and the ability to and flexibility required to adapt to it and adjust to different cultures will be associated with improved mental health. Some recommendations or implications for mental health providers. Consider that identity is intimately related to culture, as we saw, that you can balance fundamental issues when working with Latino clients, meaning culture, ethnicity, identification, sense of self, worldviews, etc. Recognize that Latinos are diverse and that identification not only represents a variety of racial and cultural backgrounds, but also migration histories, traditions, values, and practices. And that being cultural and bilingual has been identified as a protective factor for adolescents academically and psychologically. So we mentioned that being able to communicate into languages, to navigate different cultures with ease will improve outcomes. And I think that's it for my presentation. We have questions, but also I wanted to share with you a video. Cindy, I don't know if I'm not sure if you can share it with the group.
Yes, I will.
Yeah.
Let me make sure I'm a presenter again. Sorry about that.
Being Mexican American is tough. Anglos jump all over you if you don't speak English perfectly. Mexicans jump all over you if you don't speak Spanish perfectly. We got to be twice as perfect as anybody else. Why are you laughing? What's so funny? I'm serious. Our society has been here for centuries, and yet they treat us as if we just swam across the Rio Grande. I mean, we got to know about John Wayne and Pedro Infante. We got to know about Frank Sinatra and Agustin Lara. We got to know about Oprah and Christina. Anglo food is too bland, and yet when we go to Mexico, we get the runs. Now that to me is embarrassing. Japanese Americans, Italian Americans, German Americans, their homeland is on the other side of the ocean. Ours is right next door, right over there. And we got to prove to the Mexicans how Mexican we are, and we got to prove to the Americans how American we are. We got to be more Mexican than the Mexicans and more American than the Americans, both at the same time. It's exhausting. Man, nobody knows how tough it is to be a Mexican American.
Okay. So we wanted to share this clip from the movie Selena, and it's from the 90s, and you'll recognize it's from the 90s. One of the things that allows me to recognize that is the use of the term Mexican American, which was more common back then. And we see how identity keeps developing and different names and different ways to name it come up. So this video I like a lot because one of the things is that it really exemplifies the complexity of navigating different cultures, not only in terms of language, but practices. He mentions how even the food may have an impact on their body as they grow more accustomed to different foods, and the expectations that they feel that others have from them. So I just wanted to share that with the group. We have more time than we have time for questions, so we'll be happy to answer those. And if anyone if you want to learn more about this topic, let us know in the comments and we can coordinate another webinar where we can go deeper into some of the topics that we discussed. So please let us know your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Orovich and Dr. Lopez, for that excellent presentation. We have a few minutes left for questions, and we have some right here. This is a question that either it's been addressed to both of you in different instances, and it talks about, do you guys consider religion to be a protective factor in mental health?
Do you want to go first, or should I?
Let me say something really quick. First, what do we know about religious affiliation among U.S. Latinos? Things are changing. For example, less than half today say that they're Catholic. The growing share say they have no religious affiliation whatsoever. It's about 22% or so. And about 20% say they're Protestant, with the majority of that group identifying as evangelical Christian. So we've been seeing the Catholic share decline and the unaffiliated share rise overall over the last 10, 15 years. Interestingly, though, we see many Latinos will say that, for example, being Catholic is not essential to being considered Hispanic or being Hispanic. And also we find that many non-affiliated Latinos will have many cultural religious icons in their household, even though they'll say they're not religious. So there's a little bit of a combination of culture and identity mixing in with religious affiliation, but just straight out religious affiliation, the Catholic share is in decline and the unaffiliated share is on the rise.
Mm-hmm. So to add to that, in terms of the question, is religion a protective factor? It's both. Religion can be a protective factor in the sense that it can provide a sense of community, some values, ideas that promote well-being. And on the other sense, if your religion is incongruent with some of the experiences that you may be having, that may create a greater conflict. But in general, it provides a sense of community and support for many Latinos.
Excellent. Thank you to both of you for those answers. We have another question here. This is not addressed to anyone specific, but it reads, is there any data on use or knowledge of the term Latina, like Latine, as an alternative to Latinx?
Yeah, that's a really great question. At the Pew Research Center, we haven't asked about Latina yet in our surveys. However, there's a lot of press reports that around Latin America, the term is emerging as a gender-neutral alternative to many of the gendered forms in Spanish. But I want to say that this isn't just unique to the Americas or to Spanish. Other languages around the world are seeing people present and offer alternative non-gendered versions of those languages. And so this is a broad international movement. But hopefully we'll be able to get to Latina at some point in the near future.
And to add to that, it's interesting how the presentation is called The Evolution of Latino Identities, and that's really an example of how these identities and these terms have been evolving throughout time, right? Hispanic, Latino, Hispanic American, Latinx, and yes, they have, again, the context in which they are being developed, the historic experiences that we're having really point to the importance of having more inclusive terms. I remember at one point it was Latin and then the A sign, right? And that was the non-binary term that was to include both female and male. So that's really a good example of how we continue to evolve. And some of the terms come from within our own group, and some of the terms do not come from within our own groups. So thank you, Angel.
Thank you to both of you for answering those questions. Unfortunately, we don't have much time left, but those questions reflect the general input of the audience, we want to thank everybody that has been kind enough to share their thank yous and their interest on this webinar in the chat. So thank you once again. We want to express that your opinion is very important to us, and we always use it to provide more trainings like this that are aimed to the population. So feel free to complete our evaluation after this webinar in order that so the information and continue to provide these great services that we already do.
Thank you.
Once
Thank
again,
you.
thank you, Lopez,
Thank
thank you,
you.
Dr. Ronovich, and thank you to our audience. Have a great day.